Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to show you how I decorated this simple piped vintage cake with black love hearts and a birthday message on top. This cake was a vanilla 6-inch cake which was filled and crumb coated with my signature Swiss meringue buttercream, and I'm going to use the same buttercream for the outside coating, which I'm going to start piping on the sides of the cake. I like to start at the very bottom where the cake meets the cake board, piping a ring of buttercream around the cake. Once I've completed that ring, I then continue and pipe another ring on top and continue all the way up the sides of the cake. I try and keep the pressure as even as possible as I'm pushing, and a couple of times I have to readjust my hand by twisting the piping bag to make sure that the buttercream is coming out at an even pressure. Once I get towards the top of the cake, I make sure that I pipe the last ring slightly higher than the top of the cake to ensure that there's plenty of buttercream on there before piping a nice even layer on the very top of the cake. This layer doesn't have to be the most even, but it does help if you start off with an even surface. And of course, I pipe all the way to the outer rim of the cake. Now it's time to smooth out all this lovely buttercream. I'm going to start at the top of the cake with my step palette knife. Now I'm going to use my turntable to rotate the cake around, and then what I do is angle my palette knife so just one side of the knife is touching the cake, and let the turntable and the palette knife do all the work. And what I'm doing here is spreading out the buttercream, taking off any excess, and I'm also pushing that buttercream almost over the edge of the cake, and this will help us later. I'm now going to do the same sort of thing on the sides of the cake. I'm going to make sure that the palette knife is flat against the cake and spreading the buttercream side to side using the side edges of the palette knife. Now, I'm not taking buttercream off at this stage, I'm just smoothing out any gaps in between those rings that I piped on before. So now I'm going to really smooth out this buttercream. I'm going to start off by going back on the top of the cake with the palette knife and go in one smooth motion round and round until the top is nice and flat and the buttercream is smooth. And now I'm going to take my side scraper. Now, I like calling it a smoother rather than a scraper because you don't want to be scraping off this layer at this point. You just want to be smoothing out the buttercream. So you need to keep the scraper nice and straight and let the turntable do all the work. Turn the cake with confidence and fairly quickly, but you can also do it a little bit slower than I did. And the idea is that you're moving the buttercream around the cake to make sure there is an even layer. Once you have an overall even layer of buttercream, you can do what I'm doing and go a little bit slower. Now, rather than doing continuous spinning, I start to slow down the speed and do one drag with the scraper at a time. This is also a good chance to patch up any areas that may need more buttercream, such as air bubbles or just gaps that there wasn't enough buttercream in. So I do that with my palette knife and then go back over with my scraper. Now, I was really happy with the finish of the outside, so I started to clean up the excess buttercream that it's made its way upwards at the top of the cake. Now, this is really important to get those corners nice and filled. Do you remember how at the beginning I was kind of pushing the buttercream off of the edge of the cake? Well, now the side scraper pushed it upwards, and that's how you fill in those top corners. So I was going from the outside inwards and using my palette knife to sweep off the excess buttercream. Now I then wanted it to be a little bit smoother, so I went round again with my palette knife, and I don't usually do this because what happened is that it pushed the buttercream over the edge again, and then I had to go around with my side scraper. So the general rule of thumb is that if you go around with your palette knife on the top, you'll probably have to touch up the edges again with your side scraper, and then finish off by sweeping off that excess buttercream at the top of the cake with an inward motion. I wanted to make sure the top was extremely smooth because I know most of it was going to be exposed with this cake design. If it was going to be covered with lots of decoration, I don't usually give this that much attention. Finally, I clean up the surface of the cake board to wipe away any excess buttercream to make it nice and neat. Once I was happy with the overall coverage, I put it in the fridge for another 30 minutes to set before I go on with my pipe decorations. I'm starting with a vined leaf tip, this one's a Wilton 68, for the bottom ruffles of the cake. I start piping the buttercream right where the cake meets the cake board. At first, I start to go up and down with very small motions, allowing this ribbon shape to form. But what I quickly realized is that I didn't actually need to go up and down so much. The way that this piping tip works is that as the buttercream comes out, it kind of naturally ribbons anyway. But what was more important is that I kept the turntable going at a steady speed. Nice and slow, so I was in control. Once I got back to where I started, I changed to the next piping tip, which is my favorite star tip, a 4B. This creates beautiful, big, voluminous scrolls. And any vintage style cake I do, I always use this tip. So a scroll is where you start by piping the buttercream and lifting the piping bag up, and then with a slight wave of an action, bring it back down. So you kind of have a shell shape, and then do that over again and again until you form a border. I then use the same star tip on the very top of the cake and do a nice thick scroll border at the top. Now obviously this is tricky because you want to make sure that the pressure is even every scroll you pipe, but also that last scroll where you meet where you started, you kind of have to do a little flick to hide it as much as possible. I then move on to a smaller star tip, this is a Wilton 21, and go on the top edge of the side of the cake. Now this probably took the most concentration. I start with one rosette and then drag it off in a slight tail, and as the tail finishes, I do another rosette in the opposite direction and continue the tail in that direction. This really takes some practice, and I'd always recommend practicing on a flat surface before going directly on the cake. And talk about practice, now it's time to write on the top of the cake. Writing in black buttercream on a white cake is probably the most nerve-wracking thing in cake decorating, but I have done this quite a few times before. If you are newer to this, I would recommend either using a transfer or at least practicing on a flat surface quite a few times before you go onto the cake. And this always reminds me of my first job when I started cake decorating. I had to write happy birthday on a yellow cake in black buttercream, and I misspelt birthday, and I thought it was the worst thing in the world, but we were able to fix it eventually. But yes, there is literally nothing more terrifying than going wrong with black buttercream. I'm also using a plain round piping tip, this is a number 2, to pipe my writing, as well as the hearts, which I'll do next. Now I wanted them kind of randomly spread out on the sides of the cake, so I started to pipe them in random spots. To pipe the love hearts, it's actually really simple. You pipe a dot of buttercream and then drag it down diagonally, and then you pipe another spot just to the side of that and drag it down to meet the other one. So I piped them all around the cake until I was happy with the spacing and the overall coverage. Now because I had piped happy birthday slightly off-centered, I decided to add a few hearts to the top. And once I did that, I think it really balanced it out. This was the finished design, but of course it was going to a lovely customer, so I sprinkled it with some edible glitter to really make it sparkle. And that's the finished cake. I hope you enjoyed this in-depth tutorial. Like I said, piping really takes practice, but it's definitely worth it in the end. Don't forget you can find all my recipes on my YouTube channel and also on my website georgescakes.com. Tag me in any of your creations because I'd love to see them at Georges Cakes. Please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and see you soon for more tutorials.